My name's Jesse. I'm the VP of Cybersecurity over at Compass IT Compliance. Real quick intro to our company, Rhode Island, basically Rhode Island based at North Providence, founded in 2010, mainly dealing in PCI audits, but we do all sorts of different security services such as firewall reviews and penetration testing, CMMC assessments, things of that nature, right? So kind of any compliance needs you might have or any security services, check us out. Also pretty well versed in, dealing with ransomware and things of that nature. So, hey, if you guys have any other questions for me after, or you had something you wanted to bounce off me, feel free. I have, I've been doing IT, I don't know, professionally since about 1999. So I don't know how long that is. But yeah, that's kind of when I've been in the IT field. Specifically, I got into security. I taught myself a lot of different things, right? And basically, I'm into the security services where you're talking about ethical hacking or penetration testing or anything of that nature. So that's enough tooting my own horn and tooting Compass's horn. So I'm assuming everybody's seeing my screen here. I did do a share screen. Amazing how I said I could do all that other stuff, but there's a possibility that I didn't share the screen. So somebody do me a really big favor, throw up in the chat there that you can see my screen. Get a little interaction out of you people. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. All right. Here we go. So we're going to be talking about kind of reviewing your firewall, right? And this may seem a little bit like kind of old school. It's like, oh, hey, why are we talking about firewalls, right? Well, a firewall is still an essential part of your security posture, right? I mean, especially if you have services that you present to the outside world, right? On a side note, it's also kind of really important that you have a strategy for reviewing your firewall. If you have like a very active office, right? Or if you have users that remote into your office and things like that. So we're just going to cover some basics here of a firewall, why you should do a review, the different types of reviews that might be available, different standards that you might have to comply to. I'm sure there's a lot of auditors on here, because, it being an ISACA type of presentations. And then finally, we're going to go over some, in my opinion, some best practices that you could be using with your firewall. So the firewall basics, right? We should kind of all know this, but just in case, network traffic control device or service, right? There are firewalls that are in the cloud now, right? So you could buy a firewall in the cloud, point all your traffic through that. Very realistic scenario. Most places still have hardware level devices. They basically enforce your network security policy. They protect your network against external attacks, meaning that everybody has some type of IP in order to gain internet services or to present services out there on the network or out on the internet, I should say. So it makes sure that it's that control, like kind of like a bouncer that has a list of people to get into a nightclub, right? Checking that list, making sure that you're authorized to either go in or go out, right? So that's the main thing, right? Prevents connections from unauthorized sources to protect the network system, services, and resources, right? So that's all the basics of the firewall in a nutshell. I'm going to make very general categorization about the types of firewalls that are out there today and review that. I have a double U there, I just noticed, even though I'm surprised spell check didn't really pick that up. But hey, so firewall basics, really kind of understand the task need to manage our firewalls and review our firewalls. Organizations really kind of need to understand the different types of firewalls that are out there. We have our proxy firewalls. We have our traditional firewalls. And then we have this category here, our next generation firewalls, right? And that's basically what you're going to be buying nowadays, right? Like if you go out and you buy, say, the new Fortinet device, or, your company buys a new Fortinet device or a new checkpoint, those are going to be quote unquote the next generation type of firewall. And we could certainly cover that a little more in depth here down the line. So proxy firewall. So this could also kind of be like web connection traffic firewall. The idea behind this proxy firewall, and a lot of I think there's a couple of different devices out there. One that tends to ring a bell for me, and again, I haven't dealt with these specifically in a long time, but Blue Coat tends to sound familiar. So I'll just kind of cover this, and then we'll just get some feedback from some people seeing if they have any other type. But the idea behind this type of device is that any connection you make is going to do it in your name, right? Hence the term proxy, right? So say you, for example, you wanted to go out to CNN.com or, foxnews.com, depending on your political affiliation. You would go ahead and type in, on your web browser, CNN.com. The proxy firewall is going to take that, and then it is going to basically stop your session there. It's going to reach out to that site as itself and say, hey, all right, I'm going to grab this content for you and feed it back to you. But before I do that, it's going to do a little bit of analysis on it to make sure that it's safe and there's not, any malicious software on that. So, these proxy firewalls were, readily in use. They were in use, basically. I think I've seen personally, I've kind of seen the use of them go down a little bit because they are problematic too. Like if you cache a site, they cache sites for quicker response. It out of date. So that means things get out of date. So and they're a pain in the butt to configure, right? But a lot of places still use them. I know banking's big into them. Again, so like the Blue Coat type of devices. Anybody else out on the chat world there have any devices that they might kind of consider like a web proxy type of firewall? I'll take a look at the chat here and see if anybody has any good comments on that. No? All right. So we're going to move on. Again, the whole idea behind that device is to basically make it so that your machine can't connect to a malicious site. And they also have filtering built in that really kind of allows only certain sites that you would go to, right? So proxy type of firewall or different services that you get to. Traditional firewalls, like kind of right when firewalls were coming into play, they basically, firewalls do exactly what we're going to talk about here. They filter on these four main headers here. We have an Ethernet header on the data link layer, the IP header on the network layer. When I'm talking about layers, does anybody know what I'm talking about here? No. So it's going to be what we're talking about is specifically the OSI, right? The OSI, you get the 7 layers of the OSI. I always kind of remember it. You have the please do not throw sausage pizza away, right? So, the presentation, application layers, things like that. So, and that's all about network troubleshooting, right? So it would make sense that a firewall would filter on some of these layers. So for example, we talk about the data link layer, that's layer 2. You talk about frames, network layer, that's layer 3. And then finally the transport layer, that's layer 4. But again, the main things that the firewall is going to be looking at is, your IP, if it's a TCP or UDP port, and things like that. Okay. So an example of that would be, hey, anything outbound, or let's do inbound. For example, hey, allow connection on port 22. Quick quiz, anybody know 22? Come on, somebody in the chat interact with me a little bit, make me feel like I got a live audience here. 22? No one? No one? Bueller? All right, I'm going to say it. Port 22 is SSH. All right, secure socket, right? So basically, that's that command line tool. So an example of, thanks, Steve, for responding. Appreciate that. An example of a firewall rule would be something like, okay, well, inbound only allow IP 216.219.43.188 inbound, coming out from the outside on port 22, right? And that would be a TCP connection. TCP is connection oriented, where UDP is connectionless. So that makes it a little bit harder to filter on those as well. Again, with traditional firewalls, we're talking about stateless and stateful connections, packet filtering. Whoop, I have that in there twice. Whoops, sorry about that. So stateless inspection, rare, right? Because that was very early days of firewall, right? Stateless firewalls, they maintain no state tables. With stateful inspection, when I go out to the internet, the firewall knows that I initiated connection, right? So when something out on the internet is responding to me, it knows that it should allow that connection back in, right? A stateless type of firewall doesn't necessarily have that ability because it doesn't maintain that session state, right? So in the early days of firewalls, things were a lot harder to configure. And they had stateless more over stateful because it was just how it was in the beginning. And then stateful was kind of implemented, but the problem was earlier on that the maintaining that state table could be a little bit taxing on a system. But with modern computing, it's not a big deal. We have processors. I mean, my phone has a processor that's more powerful than something from 15 years ago, so 20 years ago. So that's why we're kind of in this stateful inspection, and stateless has been kind of like moved away from. So yeah, again, with the stateful maintains that record. If I'm going out, then it knows to allow me back in, right? Because you're like, whoa. And also there's a technology called natting that is there where it will, amend a different port number to your request. So it knows, hey, allow this port number back in. So that's what the stateful firewall is all about. It's also good for packet, making sure that the packet stays together, right? So you don't have packet loss. If you have packet loss on your network, then you're going to have a bad connection. You're going to have a bad time, right? You're going to be like, hey, why is my Netflix not loading, right? If you have a lot of packet loss. All right. And now we're moving into basically the next generation firewalls. And that's going to be any type of device you buy out today, with the exception of like the cloud-based devices. Some of the cloud quote unquote firewalls that you see in Azure and AWS, they do very basic filtering, right? Between network segments, right? Or into your environment. They have the ability to do more, but obviously that's a little bit higher level of a firewall. But the typical device that you would buy today, say if you were putting a hardware appliance in your place of business, would be a next generation firewall. These next generation firewalls, NGFW for short, also have the ability to be managed from like a controller of the firewalls, so that you would push down changes and updates from that central controller, right? A nice thing about these types of devices, right, is that they're basically your all-in-one stop for, your firewall solution, application filtering, antivirus, VPN, right? A lot of people, I'm sure, now have experience with VPN, where because of COVID, right, everybody got to go on remote and then had VPN credentials. Some people never had an opportunity to be on VPN because your workplace would be like, no, you have to work in the office. Well, nowadays, VPN is a very common term, stands for virtual private network, and it allows you connection. And a lot of firewalls have this capability already built in. And then with these other points with a next generation firewall, if you start looking into it, as auditors, as professionals here, you might start hearing the term zero trust access, right? And that's something that is still kind of new. It's still being explored. But the idea behind that is that you basically only allow in users and that you absolutely trust or are whitelisted, and then they're allowed access to applications that are published internally, right? So that's going to be, probably be where we're going later on instead of dealing with kind of VPN. But the next generation firewalls are where it's at. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Gartner research. If you look into, next generation firewalls, you're going to find brands like I said earlier, Checkpoint, Fortinet. You're going to find SonicWall. Firepower maybe's out there. So a whole bunch of different options out there. Do your research, decide what's best on your organization, and basically make sure that you start following the rules here. The rules and best practices I'm going to cover here. So, but why, right? So why are we talking about firewall? Is it just kind of old school, right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a firewall is your first and last line of defense against threats. So I have a kind of a question for the audience, and I'll probably end up answering it myself, but I'm just going to pose that as a question. If a threat is detected on your internal network, how do you stop it? Meaning the threat would be something like a scenario called command and control, meaning that an attacker has access to your network or a machine in your network that's then talking back out to them. And this is also a common thing that happens before ransomware is deployed, right? So there's an attacker that has an active connection in your network. And they're mapping things out. They're making moves to finally deploy ransomware on your network. So my question to you would be, well, how do you stop it, right? And I'll just wait for a chat. I mean, I'm probably going to go somewhere here, but the first thing you're going to do is you're going to put that deny all on the top of your firewall rule set, basically saying, hey, deny every connection out of this internal network, deny it and log it, right? And that's going to sever that that attacker's connection in your network. It's going to shut down network internet traffic for everybody, but it's also going to knock down that particular attacker. It's also going to shut down certain services you might offer to the outside world, like web services, things like that. However, that is your first and best defense against detecting somebody that is in your network. So you do something like that, and then you log it. I can also tell you from many, many incidents of experience here, that is the first thing you do when responding to a ransomware incident is you don't sever the internet connection, but you block and lock. And why do we do that? Well, that's going to help you identify endpoints on your internal network that might have some type of malicious software on it. Okay. Well-managed firewall will perform efficiently and safely, lowering the chance of cyber attacks within your organization. For sure. That's why we're going to be talking about firewall reviews and things like that. Firewall vulnerabilities are a key avenue for serious cyber incidents. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Again, with the why, older conflicting rules and policies can be leveraged for access by attackers or even outside threats. Out-of-date software, a little more on that later, can allow attackers to come in from the outside. Improperly placed rules or excessive rules can lead to performance issues. So we've seen a lot of different firewall reviews that we have conducted is that there's this like giant set of rules. Like we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of rules, right? The problem is that the way firewalls analyze these things is a line by line step, right? From the top down. If you have rules that you just don't need, or somebody improperly put those rules in there, it's going to cause performance issues. It's going to make it so that your end users don't get to the services that they need as quickly as possible. And finally, ports exposed publicly may lead to some type of information disclosure that you might not necessarily want. I was looking for a screenshot I had earlier, but it revealed too much of a customer information on an external assessment I did. And basically what happened is that they had a open port there, and that port was called SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol, right, which runs on port 161 of UDP. And the main purpose of that type of service, right, is to manage and monitor network endpoints. Every single network endpoint has this type of service on there, but it should only really be used for management internally, never exposed externally. So they left that open, they left it unprotected, and then I was able to get a bunch of information about their internal network that I shouldn't have got access to. And as you can imagine, if you're an auditor and a tester comes to you with this information, you're going to have a fit, right? Or even the CEO might have a fit. If you're a small organization, he likes to be, or he or she likes to be involved in that type of review. The who. Everybody's supposed to be laughing right now at that photo, right? Mixing it up a little bit, jazzing it up. But basically, yeah, who's responsible for the firewall, right? Well, the firewall management, right, is going to be the duty of the team or department in charge of the overall IT security policy, right? So I'm not saying, see, there you go. Thanks, Dan. Good smile. I'm not saying that that you're responsible for the changes to the firewall. Obviously, that would be silly, but you're overall for the overall strategy of securing the network, whoever's in charge of your IT security policy, meaning like, hey, we should allow this, we should allow this, and we shouldn't allow all this other stuff, right? And the reason for this is because basically the firewall is, like I said, your first and last line of defense of your system. If your firewall is compromised, right, everything's compromised, right? It's what it is, because that's where all your traffic's flowing in and out. Now, there might be that chance that you're that type of organization that just doesn't have internet access, but that's rare, right? So your firewall should always be scrutinized by the employee responsible for compliance, in many cases, IT auditors, right? So regular audits should be conducted and records of firewall changes should be reviewed, and you should absolutely have a change control system in place. Without a change control system in place, you're not going to have any network segmentation. You're not going to have any zones, things of that nature, and you're going to have this one big open flat network. So what happens when you have a nice open big flat network? If an attacker is able to leverage email phishing or an external vulnerability and get in, they're going to have a giant easy playground to navigate. Okay. And then eventually what's going to happen to you is you're going to get hit with ransomware, and everybody's going to be like, hey, why did this happen? Well, I'm sure there's going to be multiple reasons why it happened, but a review of your firewall is going to show that, hey, you guys weren't necessarily doing things in the correct manner. So that should kind of cover the who. And let's move on to how we evaluate externally, right? So external assessments, right? You got to look for different exposures on the internet. What do I mean by exposures? Well, port 22, that thing I was talking about earlier, SSH, which is used for command line interface. Sometimes that's exposed externally, and it doesn't need to be. The only reason it would need to be exposed internally if your network engineer is lazy or you have an MSP that is managing your firewall, right? I would not recommend having port 22 open on your firewall. If you do have it open, there's things that you're going to want to put in place, I'll cover that a little bit later, not to get too deep into it. Other things that you're going to want to look for is web logins. A lot of these firewalls, again, if you're managing them, you're going to have a web login to it. Basically, hey, admin, whatever, your username and password is, and it has a nice GUI interface so that people can interface and set up VPNs and things like that. Let's take a quick look at a nice tool. And if you've been on a presentation of mine before, you're going to notice that I like to talk about Shodan a lot, only because it highlights a lot of different things out there that people aren't necessarily aware of. So right here, what we have, is everybody still seeing my screen? Just give me a thumbs up or a yes, because thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I just want to make sure, because sometimes you share the presentation slide and, then Zoom moves things around. So I just want to make sure we're all good. Shodan, right? Shodan is basically a giant vulnerability scanner and also a port mapper, right? It's running. I don't really know when it's running. I would say probably about every 12 hours, right? It's It's searching out, it's looking at the internet. So a lot of you people that thought, oh, you can't scan my stuff, you can't scan my stuff, it's scanning your stuff, right? So if there is a publicly addressable thing out there on the internet from your organization, it's going to find it. Okay. Here's a perfect example of it. I have a couple of things that I basically pulled up here, and I'm searching for firewall types that I'm kind of familiar with. One is the Fortinet, right? So if we look through here, we have the Fortinet being broadcast on in this Italy, right? Specifically, this one looks like it might be VPN servicing, right? But we could talk about more about the different ports. If we look into it here, different ports that might be broadcasting, and kind of depending, like 443 is going to be most likely that it's looking for that web interface I was talking about. Let's see if we can maybe hit a couple of these. 8443 is another example of the web interface facet of it. So here we go, Fortinet port 8443. Let's see if we could connect this guy and no, this one's probably a better one. HTTP, okay. Let's go visit Germany. Let's see. Hopefully this doesn't make me, oh, you know what? Oh, look at that. So they actually have it kind of blocked. But the mere fact that it's out there is a little scary. It kind of depends on violation of internet usage policy. So that's good. They actually have it controlled on some level with application control, but there's a whole bunch of these out here. And my point being is that, again, there's not really a need for these services to be exposed everywhere in the world. And if you are going to expose these services like this, or if you have a need, make sure that you limit it with things like IP-based filtering, right? Meaning only allow your certain IP to connect. Let's see if we get another couple of these out here. Not too much. Again, so a lot of different things. Let's see if we can do a Fortinet port just for fun. Let's see if we can do that 22. Again, this is something that an outside security assessor could do for you. Nothing on there. Let's try Sonic Wall. And we'll do browse over here and see how many. So again, Sonic Wall, and this is definitely different logins. And some of them even have a VPN login as well. Let's see if we got port 22 anywhere here. Be surprised if we didn't. Or they could also be using port obfuscation, right? So the other thing that's kind of interesting, right, is that these are all different ports that are exposed to the internet, and some, again, a lot of these are probably, just like I was saying too, somebody just thought they were clever and that they would just go ahead and basically only expose port 22 but rename it. So all these are possibilities for me to connect in and just kind of test. So I don't see any straight port 22, but I see a lot of possibilities that it's been redirected to a different port number. And a lot of people think that's a good way of protecting it against hackers. Well, when you have an application like Shodan that's out there that's crawling basically every single thing available, then it's kind of irrelevant to do that whole port hiding. Okay. So on top of that, right, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to conduct a vulnerability assessment. Let me pull this back up. All right, so we're going to conduct a vulnerability assessment, right, where you actually have somebody come in and go, well, this is your device. Let's look at it externally, internally, specifically externally. We're concerned with the management services like I was talking about. And if those management services are exposed, there could be vulnerabilities in there that would lead to exploitation. This one here, this one was released in 2020. Showed there was over 800, well, close to 800,000 devices that were probably affected by this vulnerability. But this vulnerability allowed anybody to run arbitrary code on these machines, right? So very scary. And also when these things get published, you better believe there's these hacker groups that didn't even find the vulnerability. They're building proof of concept exploits, right? And they're trying to leverage these. So if you get a notification like this, you're going to want to stay on top of it and patch your system accordingly as soon as possible. Again, especially if you're the type of business that says, oh yeah, we need that 443 exposed, we need that 4443 exposed, then you're going to want to do that. Us at Compass, we're a smaller organization that deals with this stuff. We don't have any need for management interfaces exposed, right? So we actually had an MSP in here that we bought our device from, and they said, oh well, can you publish this service so that we can connect in and tell you when it goes up or down or has any other issue? And I'm like, well, what IP? And they're like, oh well, just leave it open. And I'm like, no, I'm absolutely not going to do that, because that's just it leaves an open hole for me. Why would I do that? Makes no sense. So again, take a look at it from that approach as well. Like, you always want to take a look at the approach of denying all, right? All right, so moving on to another major vulnerability. This one was just last month, a couple of weeks ago, right? Fortinet firewall vulnerability could give hackers full control. So this was specifically on the Fortinet overall management tool, right? So it's looking at the firewall's management tool that had this vulnerability in it, which could lead to somebody basically attacking. Same with the ASA. This one was pretty recent as well. We're looking at the ASA again. So all these different vulnerabilities are being introduced, and if you have some level of service exposed on the internet, you're going to have to be very aware of these. If you're in your organization and you go, hey, when's the last time we did an external assessment on this firewall, or we did a pen test on this firewall, and somebody goes, I don't know, that's a problem, right? If that means you've probably never done it, and that you might also have misconfigurations or exposed services that you're not necessarily aware of. And also don't really rely on the fact that your firewall admin, the guy that does multiple other roles in your organization, is securing it properly, because he has so many things going on if you don't have a dedicated firewall team. Okay, so the other thing that kind of gets overlooked a lot is the internal assessment. The internal assessment is going to, have a much better view into the problems with your firewall, right? So there's the outside attacker perspective, meaning, hey, is this something going to easily allow somebody in? And then there's also the inside person threat, or maybe an attacker got in inside or somehow, and now they're sitting on your internal network. So if you haven't reviewed it internally as well, that could be problematic, because there could be all sorts of different things set up that allow you free reign on your network, like I was talking about earlier. So there's going to probably be, if you're having an audit done externally and internally, you're going to find a lot more things internally based on the standard that you're trying to go after. Let's take a quick look at an assessment finding for an internal audit on an ASA firewall that Compass did recently. So scrolling up, this is basically an audit report of a Cisco Adaptive Security Appliance Firewall, ASA version 9.1, which is pretty old. It's not as up to date as it should be. And if we kind of look down a little bit on it here, as you can see, we found a number of findings, 17 high, 27 medium, and 4 low. And all of these are basically classified on the CVS score, okay? So let's kind of look into a couple of the different issues that we're saying are issues as far as an internal perspective looks. So let's take a look at these. And some of these you guys will be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, for example, well, the enable password, right? Meaning gives you a higher level of admin access, was a dictionary-based password. That's no good, right? An external assessment isn't going to find that, but an internal assessment could, especially when you have somebody looking at the internal facing aspect or looking at the configuration. Okay, so that's obviously a major finding, right? You shouldn't have a dictionary-based password to give somebody administrative access onto a network device. Long HTTP service session timeout. So this is basically that, again, that internal management interface type thing. You know how everybody's on a bank. If you're on your bank and you don't have activity for X amount of periods, it says, hey, we're going to log you off because you haven't been doing anything. That's a security procedure. The same thing should apply to internal network devices, your computer. If you get up, if you walk away from your computer without locking it, it should lock eventually, right? SSH protocol version 1, very old protocol, no good. Let's go through these a little bit quicker. Same thing, long SSH session timeout, allowing somebody a timeout, not having a good timeout set means that somebody could steal a session. What else we got? RIP version 1, again, older protocols, no good. Filterless packets to network destinations and any port. If your firewall is not filtering, what's the point in having a firewall? That's what this rule is doing here. It's saying allow any. That's not good, right? And it depends on the group too, like especially if you're in a tightly controlled compliance area where, you know, like say, for example, the back office people, right, shouldn't have access to, say, the research facilities network, right? But if there's a rule in there that says, hey, back office, any, then they're going to be allowed anywhere they want, right? And that's not something that you can necessarily pick off an external assessment. Clear text protocols, no good, right? No good because somebody could be sitting on your network, sniffing network traffic. And if something was passing a password through that network, they're going to capture passwords and then use that password to potentially move around and escalate privileges into other systems. What else we got here? Administrative services. Your administrative services on your firewall internally shouldn't be available to anybody on the network. All bad stuff. Keep going. No syslog, clear text SNMP. So there's all sorts of things. Oh, this is a good one, especially with COVID. VPN configured with weak encryption. And there's another one, VPN configured with aggressive mode enabled. If you have a VPN endpoint that's publicly facing and it has aggressive mode enabled, I could capture your hashed password, and then I could throw it in one of my GPU Bitcoin miners or Ethereum miners and use it to crack that password, right? So again, an internal assessment, key to overall firewall security. Once you get one done, right, you're going to want to really look into tighten up your controls if there are a lot of findings. I could recall one that we did where there were a lot of findings, right? And then in that second one, not so much. Okay, but this is what your typical assessment would look like or should look like, and it calls out a lot of different things. Now, some of these items could be debatable, right? Could be debatable depending on the scenario, but everything I just kind of highlighted right here as far as security goes, there's really no debate. Another thing that we're going to look at, which you could almost maybe get with an external assessment, depending on what is exposed, is different vulnerabilities that your device is vulnerable to. So if we look here, all these different CVEs, right? And it's kind of basically telling you, hey, if you don't get on top of this, you're highly vulnerable, and that it also highlights that you're out of date on your software. Okay. Moving on. So we're kind of going to get into some audit stuff, not major. I'm not an auditor, right? I don't, that's not my primary profession, but I'm going to talk about a little bit about kind of different standards that, you know, firewall audits are big on. And the one that I can think of that is most critical for getting your firewall audit is PCI. Okay, PCI compliance, I'm sure people are familiar with it. But if you look at the majority of the requirements, you know, we have 1, 2, 6, 8, 10, 11 here. That's critical at looking at your firewall for PCI compliance, right? So, you know, again, if you're not doing this and you're trying to adhere to PCI standards or PCI compliance, you know, you absolutely have to do a regular firewall security assessment and look for the things I was talking about. So, for example, do not use vendor supplied defaults on a system. Well, when we found that enable password, that's probably a bad example, but of password, that password is usually a vendor supplied default, right? If you're not doing logging in that example with that ASA, you're not basically controlling, tracking, or monitoring access to network resources via the firewall. What else we got here? Identify and authenticate access to system components. Well, if you have clear text in place, that's not going to necessarily cover you, right? What else? What kind of standards do we have here? So other standards that might come into play. I shouldn't have put CMMC in here. A bunch of my fellow Compass employees are more well versed in CMMC than I am, but also like FISMA follows NIST, right? And it also has strict guidelines in firewall configuration. Okay. And then finally, I think what I'm going to talk about next, and we'll open it up for questions and just see, make sure everybody kind of enjoy this small presentation on firewalls and why it's kind of important to review. Let me look at best practices for external facing. And I kind of already talked about these, but to just reiterate, don't expose web management, right? We saw thousands upon thousands of entries of web management being exposed publicly on the internet. The one example I tried to show you, of course, blocked me out, and that's just how it goes. But if you do need web management, only allow it per certain IP. Don't expose SNMP or SSH, right? Both of those are going to lead to information leakage, or possible, especially with SSH, is going to lead to brute force. If you have to use SSH, secure it with not a password, but something called a private key. Okay, and private key pairs are common with SSH services. But also on the same line, make sure you're filtering on IP. Only allow certain IPs to connect to your service. Do monthly checks for software updates, or have an alert set up that tells you when there is a software update or your regular patch system. Again, some people tend to forget that the firewall has an OS on it. We saw that example of that ASA I was highlighting for everybody that was well behind on the patch schedule, right? Everybody focuses on Windows servers and maybe Linux servers, but don't forget about your network devices, especially those network devices that pass external traffic. And finally, scan your firewall for exposed services, because there might be something out there that you're not aware of. That Shodan service might be picking up things that you're not aware of, or your firewall administrator could have maybe configured something improperly, right? Only allow trusted traffic destinations. All right, so this is going to be, people are going to probably groan at this, right? But it's a fact, right? That if you in your organization set the policy that, say, for example, you run a call center, right? And you only allow access on the internet to the call center application, meaning somebody can't go look on CNN, somebody can't go Google something, somebody can't go, check Zillow for see if their house went up in price because they're looking to get out of this call center job and sell and bail, right? If you strictly control access to what you could go to, your risk is going to go way, way down. That's all there is to it. It's going to be an unpopular thing, right? People like to browse on the internet, right? And realistically speaking, you should only have access to the business resources you need to complete your job, right? And you'll always get those people go, well, I'm in marketing, like my friend Nick here, I need access to Facebook and Twitter. I'm like, fine, go home and do it, right? But that's going to basically make sure your network's tight, right? internally also look for unused rules. A lot of these firewalls nowadays actually are telling you, hey, you got unused rules. Why don't you get rid of them? They haven't been used in 6 months. Happened to me when I was doing an audit. I was like, oh boy, yeah, that's right. I got rid of that application. I don't need that rule anymore. Put comments on all your rules, right? There should be a very specific reason why in your change control process to label why a rule is put into place, right? And how long it's going to be there, if it's going to be there permanently, and who put the change in place, right? Very specific area for comments. And that also makes me change control. Don't allow a developer in your network go, hey, I need access to this. Open up the firewall, right? Don't do that. A major client of ours, I shouldn't say client of ours, that might hint at who they are, but so an organization I know of was basically not putting in proper change control, and yeah, they got hit with ransomware, right? So bad stuff, right? When you don't have auditing and change control in place. Send logs to a CM and audit the logs, right? Basically meaning, hey, have a place where all these logs are aggregated and alerted on, because it could give you a hint that something is not right. For example, if you see a large high volume of external traffic going to something like Dropbox at 1 a.m, what is that going to hint you? Basically, that's going to hint that, hey, somebody's got data exfiltration, right? And then finally, limit access to the firewall. Should be tightly controlled. If you have 1 or good 2 firewall admins, that's all you really need in a large organization, right? And then finally, I think that's, oh, wait, I got a couple more change controls, and I see I got a couple questions getting popped up there, and we'll try to address those best I can. Change control, I already kind of talked about, and again, documentation as far as your overall change management. If you have another benefit of having this change control in place is that if after you implement that firewall rule change and something breaks, you know what, it's going to be a lot easier to roll back that change if it's well documented. All right. I already kind of see a question kind of pop up here, and everybody could see it on the chat as well. I'm going to see if we can address that. I got to scroll up. Give me a minute. How have you seen interactions requirement being made for firewalls between? I'm reading this kind of silently. I'll read it out loud. Rebecca, good question from Rebecca. Let me scroll up to see if we have anything else. Nick saying he needs access to everything. How have you seen interactions for compliance requirements being managed for firewalls between the network team and security team? I've seen environments where network engineer is managing firewalls and rule sets, but the security team is one responsible for reviewing the logs. The problem here is that the security team doesn't have as much knowledge of what the firewall alerts are being triggered, even given that they are not network engineers. Yeah, it's true, but they own the responsibility because they're a logging tool where logs are being sent. And your relationship was in the most successful and least successful ways to manage the relationship. Yeah. So Rebecca, that's a great question. And you run into that a lot, right? Because what ends up happening, like you're saying, is that, not necessarily that the security person isn't a network engineer, right? So they might not know that the network engineer could come and be like, oh yeah, that's not a big deal. That's just a we need that port for so-and-so, right? So what I would suggest you do is, right, you should have a great working relationship with the network engineers. It shouldn't be a battle in between. And unfortunately, sometimes it does come to that, right? Because the security auditors or the people are being seen as saying, hey, you network engineers aren't doing your job properly, right? But when a certain alert that you feel like raises questions that is a particular problem, right? The best way I've seen it be dealt with, right, is that you take that particular alert that you have, right, and you analyze it as a security person. You might bring in some other people to get their thoughts on it, right? And then you go to the network engineering team with it, and specifically the network engineering team's manager. And then you go, hey, we see this alert. Tell us a little bit about it. What's going on with it? And if you feel like they're giving you the runaround, well, you go, okay, what we're going to do is, right, we're going to mark this, right? And you're going to, and as the network manager, the network people, we're going to log this, we're going to monitor it, and we're going to say, hey, if anything happens in the organization specifically as a result of this alert, you know what? And obviously we got to do it a little more politically to make it so it's not like combative. Be like, the network manager is going to accept all risk on this particular alert. So if something happens because of this particular port or protocol being open, it's on the network manager, right? And we're going to need you to sign this, amendment. And it doesn't work that way, I know, obviously. But if you approach it like, hey, so you're accepting all risks that this protocol is on, or that this port is open, or that we're seeing this alert, and you're accepting this risk, and it's well documented, that network manager is going to be like, hey, no, guys, we're going to look into this a little bit deeper. That's why I've seen it be most successful, right? Because then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we made that change. It wasn't a big deal, right? Or we were putting in that change, things like that. So that's kind of the most successful, and it's a tough spot to be in. As a security people, you're basically auditing logs. As the auditors, you're auditing things, and you kind of have to go on what they're telling you. But another type of thing to do would be pull in a third party, where you might have a security professional like me that has like a strong networking background. On top of that, be able to tell them, guys, that's not true, right? Because I have no, I could basically say, no, that's not true. The auditor's right. This is bad. You have to turn this off, right? So there's different ways to handle it, but the most successful thing is where you have a nice process involved, and you have top level buy-in from your CEO, your CIO saying, no, security is key. Security of the organization is, you guys figure this out. They're saying this is bad. I don't want to see this again, right? Hopefully I kind of danced around that question a little bit, Rebecca, but that's kind of the best thing I was saying, is where you have a good working relationship and you have ownership of the issues being presented, meaning that, hey, okay, Mr. Network Manager, that's responsible for these network engineers. So you're telling me this is accepted risk by you, and then you document it, and then you take it from there, right? There's a new term out there to describe antivirus malware. I get yes. Well, maybe I know the term, Steve. Steve has asked questions. A new term out there to describe antivirus malware detection, IDS, IPS. Do you happen to know this term? Yes, and maybe I do. You might be referring to enhanced detection response or managed detection response. Basically, what we're looking for is that when you have enhanced detection response, managed detection response, those types of platforms are really looking at a holistic view of everything, right? Instead of traditional antivirus that goes off of malware signatures, or instead of your traditional intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system that looks for network traffic, these enhanced detection response systems and enhanced protection systems and MDR are taking a look at all those components, and then have control over, or blocking that network traffic, disabling that disabling that user, killing that process. So Steve, that might be what you're referring to. I'm not necessarily sure, but that's kind of where, if you think of programs like, there's one that Compass likes to do with Cynet, but you have CrowdStrike, things like that, and that's a more enhanced level of detection. Rebecca's got another question here. Thank you. Are you familiar with simple reference guides for security team to have on hand to help identify the most worrisome alerts that may be triggered on any given time? So what I would look for, Rebecca, I don't think I have any hands-on guide, but anything specifically on hand, but it's going to be tough. So what you want to look for is indications, mainly in today's environment, of things of command and control. So if you look up command and control services, maybe reference MITRE, M-I-T-R-E. I'm sure you guys have heard of MITRE. It gives you kind of attack patterns to look for a command and control. So those would be the types of things that you would really want to look for in today's environment, because if you have any type of command and control activity that's going outside, then that's problematic. And the other thing that you want to look for is if you have brute force attempts on your external devices, for sure.